You're tuning in for another deep dive, and today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, really. Our sense of right and wrong.
Yeah.
We all have one, but uh, where does it actually come from? Is it something that grows, like our moral compass matures? Or could it just be, well, about our politics, maybe,
hmm
left versus right? Or even just uh, how articulate we are?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've been digging into this, specifically looking at some research from 1999 that uses something called the Defining Issues Test, or DIT.
Ah, the DIT, right.
Yeah, and it's designed to measure how people think through moral problems. But this study really puts it under the microscope, asking, is what the DIT measures really moral development, or is it like just picking up on someone's political views, or, how good they are with words?
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then,
Yeah.
to really unpack this challenge, because it questions the whole idea of moral growth, doesn't it? Critics are saying, hey, maybe when the DIT says someone's at a higher stage, it just means they're liberal or they talk a good game.
Exactly. They're questioning if there's anything uniquely moral or developmental going on there at all.
And the DIT itself, the study mentions, it's about understanding cooperation in society, right?
Yeah.
Moving from like personal stuff to bigger picture issues.
Precisely. It looks at how our thinking shifts from focusing on, say, immediate relationships to grappling with broader societal systems, laws, institutions, that kind of thing.
Okay, so the central question for everyone listening today is, when you make a moral judgment, is that coming from some kind of genuine developmental process? Or are we just seeing, I don't know, the influence of our political tribe or vocabulary? Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with that first challenge, the idea that political attitudes are really what's being measured. The basic argument is that those stages, the DIT seems to show, like Kohlberg's ideas, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional.
Yeah, I remember those. Self-interest rules, then principles, roughly.
Right. The critics argue those aren't really stages of growth. They say they just happen to line up with the political spectrum. Conservative views, according to this argument, tend to map onto the conventional stages, while liberal views correlate more with the post-conventional ones.
So it's like saying the DIT isn't actually measuring moral maturity. It's just a roundabout way of figuring out if someone leans left or right. And I think the criticism also suggested the underlying theories, like Kohlberg's, might even be biased towards liberal ideas, maybe influenced by philosophers like John Rawls.
That's definitely part of the critique. Critics like Emler back in the 80s, they really pushed this idea that what looked like development was maybe just two different but equally valid political worldviews. They felt the model unfairly painted liberal thinking as somehow more advanced.
But the people behind the DIT, the neo-Kohlbergians, they push back on that, don't they? They say the link isn't just about political labels.
Right, that's a really key point for them. Their argument is that it's about a more fundamental change in how people understand social cooperation itself. It's a shift from simply accepting existing rules to critically evaluating those rules based on shared community ideals like fairness or justice.
Okay.
And that conceptual development, they argue, is what then influences political attitudes, not the other way around.
Ah, I see. So your basic understanding of how society should work shapes your political views, rather than just picking a political side and inheriting its views. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Emler. What about those fakeability studies? That sounds like pretty strong evidence for the critics.
Yeah, the fakeability studies were definitely a big part of the challenge. Emler's work is a prime example. He basically had people take the DIT and then take it again, but this time instructed them to answer like they thought a radical liberal or a conservative would.
And what happened?
Well, their scores changed, pretty much as you'd expect. If they faked being liberal, their scores went up, suggesting higher moral development on the DIT scale. If they faked being conservative, their scores tended to go down.
Ooh, okay. So the critics looked at that and said, see, it's not measuring deep cognitive structures. It's just measuring if someone can mimic a political viewpoint. They basically argued it was just a complicated political opinion poll.
That was their takeaway, yeah. They even suggested you could get the same info with a simple "how liberal conservative are you?" question. But the DIT researchers weren't buying it. They pointed to a whole range of other evidence, trying to show the DIT measures something unique, even when you factor in politics.
Okay, let's dig into that counter evidence then. The paper outlines, 6 different criteria they looked at. The first one is correlations with moral comprehension. What's that about?
Right. Moral comprehension isn't just about agreeing with a moral position. It's about actually understanding the reasoning behind different moral arguments, even the ones you don't agree with. So it's a deeper level of understanding.
And the critics would predict What? A weak link if the DIT is just politics.
Exactly. If it's just political preference, why would you necessarily understand the nuances of different moral philosophies better? But the research by Rest and others actually found a pretty substantial correlation between DIT scores and moral comprehension scores.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. When they statistically controlled for political attitudes, basically, mathematically removing the influence of whether someone was liberal or conservative, that strong link between DIT scores and moral comprehension still held up.
Ah, so even taking politics out of the equation, higher DIT scores still meant better understanding of moral concepts.
That's what the data suggested. It implies that scoring high isn't just about parroting political talking points. It reflects a genuine grasp of complex moral ideas.
That is pretty compelling against the "it's just politics" claim.
Okay, well,
What's the second criterion?
distinguishing expert groups. Yeah, the logic here is if the DIT measures real development, it should be able to tell the difference between groups you'd expect to have different levels of moral reasoning. Think people who study this stuff for a living versus maybe people in other fields.
Like comparing philosophy grad students to, say, business students.
Precisely. And studies have done that. They consistently find that students specializing in philosophy or political science, fields that grapple directly with ethical and societal structures, tend to score higher on the DIT than students in many other fields.
Okay, but couldn't that just be because philosophy students tend to be more liberal?
That's what the critics would say. But the key finding, as highlighted in the source paper, is that these differences between groups remain significant even after controlling for political attitudes. So you take two people with similar political views, one studying ethics and one studying something else, the ethics student is still likely to score higher on the DIT.
So again, it suggests that DIT is tapping into something related to the process of reasoning about ethics, not just the political conclusion. Okay, criterion 3, longitudinal gains. This is about change over time, right?
Yep. If it's truly developmental, individuals should show progress as they get older and gain more experience. And longitudinal studies tracking the same people over years consistently show that DIT scores do tend to increase from adolescence through adulthood.
And how does politics play into that over time? Do people just become more liberal and their DIT scores go up as a result?
Well, it's interesting. One study by Rest, mentioned in the paper, followed people from high school into their 20s. It found that, yes, DIT scores generally increased over time, but it also found that attitudes on things like law and order tended to become more liberal on average.
Uh-huh. So maybe the DIT gain is just reflecting becoming more liberal.
Not so fast. Because even though being more liberal at any single point in time often correlated with higher DIT scores, the increase in DIT scores over time remains statistically significant even when they controlled for the change in those political attitudes.
Wow, okay. So the moral reasoning development seems to be happening somewhat independently of the political shifts, even if they often move in similar directions.
That's the interpretation, yes. The DIT gains weren't just an echo of becoming more politically liberal.
Fascinating. Okay, criterion 4, sensitivity to intervention.
Yeah.
This is about education, right?
Right. If moral reasoning is something that develops, then educational programs specifically designed to promote it, like dilemma discussions, ethics courses, should actually boost DIT scores. And generally, the research shows they do.
But how do they separate that effect from just influencing someone's political views? If an ethics class makes you more liberal, wouldn't your DIT score go up anyway, based on the correlation?
That's a fair question. And it's true, these studies often don't have direct measures of political attitude change. But researchers got creative. They sometimes looked at the specific choices participants made on the DIT dilemmas as a kind of proxy for liberal versus conservative leanings within the test itself.
Okay.
What they found was that even if those specific choices shifted a bit during the intervention, maybe reflecting a slightly more liberal stance on the dilemmas, those shifts didn't fully account for the overall increase in the DIT reasoning score. The intervention seemed to be boosting the complexity of their moral thinking in a way that went beyond just changing their specific opinions on the dilemmas.
Interesting workaround. Okay, criterion 5, correlations with political attitudes. This feels like we're circling back, but I guess it's about the nature of the correlation.
Exactly. The DIT researchers don't deny that there are correlations between DIT scores and how people feel about various political and social issues. That's expected if moral reasoning informs political views. But they argue it doesn't mean the DIT just reduces to a simple liberal-conservative scale. It's more complex. Multiple studies found that DIT scores have a unique predictive relationship with specific political attitudes and policy stances, even after you control for someone's general self-described political label.
So knowing someone's DIT score tells you something more about their specific political views than just knowing if they call themselves liberal or conservative.
That seems to be the case. It suggests the DIT is tapping into the underlying reasons for holding certain views, which adds predictive power beyond just the political label itself. The way you think about fairness influences which liberal or conservative stances you adopt and why.
Right, it's a more nuanced connection.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, criterion 6, links to behavior. Does how you score actually relate to what you do?
The ultimate test, maybe. And yes, studies have found links. For instance, research showed a connection between higher DIT scores and things like voting intentions or actual voting behavior. And crucially, this link held up even when political attitudes were statistically controlled for.
So your level of moral reasoning, as per the DIT, has an independent influence on your actions, beyond just your political identity.
That's the implication. It suggests the way you reason through these dilemmas has real-world behavioral consequences.
Okay, so looking across all 6 criteria, moral comprehension, expert groups, change over time, education effects, the specific nature of political correlations, and links to behavior, the argument seems pretty strong that the DIT isn't just measuring political attitudes.
That's certainly the conclusion the neo-Kohlbergians draw from this body of evidence. Now, ready to tackle the other big challenge, the verbal ability argument.
Yeah, let's do it. So this idea came from Sanders and colleagues in the mid-90s. They basically said, maybe it's not politics, maybe it's just intelligence, specifically verbal intelligence.
Exactly. Their hypothesis was that maybe scoring high on the DIT just means you're good with words, you understand complex sentences, you have a good vocabulary, or maybe just high general cognitive ability, often called G.
And they did a study where they statistically removed the effect of verbal ability.
Yes, they used statistical techniques to partial out verbal ability scores from DIT scores. And when they did that, they found that the DIT's correlation with some other variables seemed to disappear or weaken significantly.
So their conclusion was, DIT is just a fancy IQ test, essentially.
Pretty much. They suggested that, like maybe many psychological tests, it might just be tapping into general intelligence rather than a specific moral judgment ability. But there were issues raised about which variables they looked at.
Right, the paper we're looking at points out that the criterion variables, Sanders used things like family background, leisure activities, weren't really typical measures you'd associate directly with moral reasoning development.
Exactly. It's not immediately clear why your moral reasoning should strongly predict your hobbies after controlling for verbal ability, for instance. So the DIT researchers went back to their own set of validity criteria, the same 6 we just discussed, but this time examining them while controlling for verbal or general cognitive ability.
Okay, let's run through them again from this angle. Moral comprehension first.
Yep. And again, studies found that the significant link between DIT scores and moral comprehension scores remained even after controlling for measures of general cognitive ability or verbal ability, like IQ scores or reading comprehension tests.
So understanding complex moral arguments is related to DIT scores in a way that isn't just explained by being generally smart or good with words.
That's what the evidence indicates. There seems to be a specific connection between the reasoning measured by the DIT and the ability to understand moral concepts.
Okay, what about distinguishing the expert groups, the philosophy students, etc.? Could they just be more verbally skilled?
Well, it's likely they are highly verbally skilled, but so are grad students in many other selective fields, like medicine, for example. The 1999 paper argues that while direct verbal ability scores weren't available in one key comparison study, the large DIT differences found between, say, philosophy political science students and medical students are unlikely to be solely due to differences in general cognitive ability, given how selective med school admissions are. The specialized focus on ethical reasoning seems a more plausible explanation for the DIT score difference.
That makes intuitive sense. You're comparing highly intelligent groups, so the difference is likely in their specific training or focus. Okay, longitudinal gains, DIT scores increasing over time. What about verbal ability gains?
Good question. A meta-analysis looked at this specifically during the college years. It found that the average increase in DIT scores was significantly larger than the typical increase seen in general verbal ability tests over the same 4-year period.
So moral reasoning seems to develop at a faster rate, or at least a different rate, than general verbal skills during college.
It suggests they aren't just the same thing developing in lockstep. DIT seems to measure growth that's distinct from just getting better at language.
Right. And criterion 4, sensitivity to intervention, the education effect.
This is where that logic class versus ethics class study is really telling. Remember, the logic class improved logic scores, which likely involve verbal skills, but not DIT scores. The ethics class improved DIT scores, but not logic scores.
A clear double dissociation, as they say.
Exactly. It strongly suggests DIT measures something specifically related to moral reasoning that can be targeted by ethics education, and it's different from general logical or verbal skills improved by other types of instruction. Another meta-analysis confirmed DIT is more sensitive to moral problem-solving interventions than just general academic learning.
Okay, that's pretty clear cut. Now, criterion 5, correlations with political attitudes. Does controlling for verbal ability change that relationship?
Apparently not much. Studies found that the link between DIT scores and specific political attitudes still held up even after controlling for measures of general cognitive ability, like GPA or standardized test scores, which correlate with verbal ability. So your cognitive ability doesn't seem to be the main driver of the connection between how you reason morally, DIT, and your political views.
Interesting. And finally, criterion 6, the link to behavior. Does that connection survive controlling for IQ or verbal scores?
Yes, and this is supported by quite a few studies looking at diverse behaviors. Research found that the relationship between DIT scores and things like professional conduct in nursing, dentistry, cheating behavior, or even delinquency remains significant even after accounting for IQ, SATAC scores, or GPA.
Wow. So DIT scores predict behavior even among people with similar levels of general cognitive or verbal ability.
That's the critical finding. It suggests the way you reason morally has predictive power for your actions that goes beyond just how smart you are or how well you use language.
Okay, so pulling it all together, whether we're looking at the challenge from political attitudes or the challenge from verbal ability, the body of evidence presented in this 1999 paper seems to consistently point towards the DIT measuring something distinct.
That's the clear conclusion they draw. While moral judgment, as measured by the DIT, is definitely related to political attitudes and cognitive abilities, it doesn't seem to be reducible to either one. The DIT appears to capture a unique developmental trajectory related to how we understand social cooperation, justice, and fairness.
Right. They aren't totally separate bubbles, but they aren't the same thing either. There's interplay, but DIT seems to have its own unique contribution.
And the authors are careful to note limitations, of course. Not every single possible political attitude or verbal skill measure has been tested in conjunction with the DIT, and there are differences between the DIT, a recognition task, and, say, Kohlberg original interview method, a production task.
Sure, no research is ever perfectly exhaustive, but the consistency of the findings across so many different types of studies, different groups of people, different statistical approaches, that seems pretty powerful.
Absolutely. The robustness across these different validity checks really strengthens the claim that moral judgment, as operationalized by the DIT, represents a distinct psychological construct that develops over time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. If moral judgment is this distinct capacity, something that grows and isn't just politics or vocabulary, what does that mean for us? How should it change how we think about, say, ethics education? Or how we engage in political debate, which is so often framed in moral terms?
Yeah, can we actually foster this kind of development in a targeted way, a way that goes beyond just trying to shift someone's party affiliation or teach them fancier words?
And what role does understanding this developmental process play in how we try to build a better, fairer society? Definitely adds another layer to think about as we navigate all the moral complexities out there. Thanks for diving deep with us today.